Today our novelist is Iris Murdoch. She's a professional philosopher as well as a novelist, and although the two activities are very different, being a philosopher does affect what she says about books, as I think you'll see. You'll notice that we don't say much at all about her life, but get straight on to this question of philosophy and novel writing. Both deal with human nature, though with different tools, and if one person does both things, they're bound to get involved in interesting ways. Iris Murdoch has now published 8 novels, and we're able by this time to form a pretty strong impression of her gift and her personality as a novelist. Novels, she seems to say, have to do two things that can't easily be done together. They have to give the reader a sense of the depth and freedom of his own personality by involving him with fictional characters who have mysterious depth and freedom themselves. But novels also have to provide the satisfactions that come from anything that has artistic form. In the case of a novel, it is not only clever plotting, but the sort of subtle balances and suggestions that we need to recognize before we're willing to think a book is more than merely entertainment. And this second duty, plot and form and shape, so forth, tends to conflict with the first, if only because it does limit the freedom of the characters. Now, Miss Murdoch is fond of very complex plots, and she also tends to write a lot about love. It's a force that liberates the personality, but sometimes she makes people slaves to it. So, if you're talking to Miss Murdoch about her books, you tend to dwell on the struggle between freedom and pattern, and also on what she seems to mean by love. All these issues come up in an unofficial rose, and you'll hear her talking about them. An unofficial rose, among other things, deals with all manner of differences between the natural life and the life of art, between artless people like Anne and the kind of virtue she can aspire to, between people like that and people like Anne's husband who crave for consciously developed form. It's the difference, as the title tells us, between the unofficial wild rose of the hedgerow and the clever and beautiful cultivated hybrid of the garden. But you'll notice once more that although the book has this pattern, in a form as complicated as a novel, there are other themes and patterns that the writer herself can't authoritatively explain. The tale lives apart from the teller, and this has to happen even when the artist is as self-conscious and elaborate as Miss Murdoch. Near the end of the interview, I asked her about a remark made by one of her characters in An Unofficial Rose, by Swan, the parson. He says that too great a devotion to form is fatal to love. Now, Miss Murdoch says that creating free characters in a novel gives the writer a feeling that is close to love for the characters. But presumably the more elaborate and subtle you make your plot, the more you allow form to deprive them of their freedom, the less worthy they are of love. Anyway, I think Miss Murdoch will leave you with the feeling that good novels are themselves very mysterious things. Miss Murdoch, it's not altogether common for the same person to be philosopher and novelist. Are the two tasks fully compatible?
Well, they're compatible, except in the sense that one has a limited amount of time, and they're both potentially very full-time jobs. Yes, they're compatible. In fact, to some extent, they possibly help each other.
Does being a philosopher give you a special kind of angle on the business of writing fiction? Are you more interested in certain aspects of the problem of writing fiction than non-philosophers might be?
No, I don't think so. I think as a novelist, one is just the pupil of great novelists of the past in a quite straightforward way. I don't think being a philosopher alters or certainly doesn't help one's job as a as an artist when writing a novel. I suppose my interests in philosophy are chiefly in moral philosophy and in political philosophy, and possibly, to some extent, thinking about situations in moral philosophy, thinking about problems of freedom and problems of moral decision and so on. This may affect sometimes the way one portrays a character.
There's a real difference, is there, between the way you think about a moral decision as a moral philosopher and the way in which you think about it as a novelist?
Well, philosophy is very different stuff from fiction. Writing philosophy is a very different job. One's aiming at a different result. One's not aiming at producing a work of art, which is a quite special kind of thing. One's aiming at producing a but the subject matter is the same, that is human nature operating.
In your first novel, you included a philosopher, in fact two, who discussed problems relating both to the forms of fiction and to the use of language in general together. Isn't this an indication, as it were, that even in fiction you tend to provide patterns which could be loosely described as philosophical?
Well, that was rather exceptional. The introduction of an actual piece of philosophy into a novel, I think it's a very dangerous thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
I think that certain French writers attempted. Sometimes they get away with it, sometimes not. I think it's very dangerous to produce pieces of theorizing which could actually be lifted out, as it were, because they will tend to stick out of one's plot and attract attention to themselves.
It is a fact that Hugo, in your first book, says things that you happen to agree with, I think, isn't it? About...
Which things?
Well, for example, his comment on, I can't remember the exact words, when he speaks of people not having the right to be consoled. Why should anyone think, he says, that life ought to be endurable? And you've made the point that form in art is often a way of consoling people for various privations.
Yes, I mean, this is something I don't feel altogether clear about myself. I think that, well, I think there's very, very little great art. And one reason for this is that both the artist and, of course, the consumer, too, as it were, seek too readily to be consoled, that some kind of pleasing, consoling pattern, I mean, sentimentality would be one aspect of this, which then prevents one from producing something which has got the kind of hardness and truthfulness which great art has got.
Yes, in fact, the more popular the literature, the more conventional the plot is a good general rule, I suppose.
Yes.
Would you agree with this? So that, and this has an aspect which could be called consoling, the fact that people know what design generally the thing is going to follow.
Yes, yes, and I think even things which are good, which aren't obviously bogus or cheap or grossly sentimental, can tend to fail in this particular way because there's some sort of easy pattern which emerges, which the writer then follows.
What is lost by undue attention to formal values? Is it the quality of life itself, perhaps?
Well, in a way, I don't know that one can have undue attention to formal values. I think form is frightfully important in art, but well, in a novel, of course, it can, I suppose, possibly conflict with really free development of character, that one finds a sort of tension between producing a very satisfactory pattern and letting some character have his way, or let rip, as it were.
Now, if we turn to An Unofficial Rose, which is the book we have especially to think about, there is a distinct pattern in that book of more or less inexplicit debate, I should say, on this question of form and its relation to life and value. I suppose one could say that Randall represents one attitude and that the Parson Swan represents another. Could you say something about that?
Well, the main contrast, I suppose, is between Randall and Anne. I mean, Anne is the unofficial rose. She is the formless object. I mean, this contrast between represents in a rather different way the same contrast that Hugo and Jake present. the conflict between Hugo and Jake is I mean, this is putting it in a kind of pompous way, but is a conflict between the man who is an artist and who wants form and who has to run the risks of saying things and using words and so on, and the man who is potentially, potentially the saint or potentially the good man, who renounces, who renounces speech in a way. I mean, this is something that's always seemed to me paradoxical, that speech itself can in some way be immediately misleading or immediately consoling. I mean, there's some, in a kind of mad way, I want to say that the really good person doesn't say anything. Anyway, in the Randall Anne situation, the contrast is a slightly different one, but perhaps similar.
Yes, there's a kind of aesthetic of silence involved here too, isn't there? Because Anne, there's a suggestion almost that any kind of action is bound to derogate from goodness in some sense. Is there not?
Well, I wouldn't want to imply that. I mean, the book may suggest that because of the sort of ineffectualness attaching to Anne's relations with Felix and so on, and the inconclusiveness. But what I was more thinking of was the way in which perhaps the good person doesn't have a picture of himself. I mean, this was something that I wanted to say about Hugo, that Hugo didn't recognize himself when he's presented by Jake in this picture. I mean, Jake is worried in case Hugo says, you've caricatured me. In fact, Hugo doesn't recognize himself at all. Well, now, Anne, again, has no image of herself. She is unable to reflect on herself, whereas Randall, who is, as it were, the artist, he represents the man who imposes form upon himself and upon the world, and who wants form, and who loves form in the roses and so on.
Imposes form on roses. But
yes.
In fact, when you embody feelings of this kind in a novel, you have to do it in terms which are not explicit, don't you? So you use roses, you use... Well, could you tell us about Miranda's dolls, which are clearly relevant also, in some sense, to the situation?
I don't know that I've got any very clear theory about Miranda's dolls. I mean, they represent a particular sort of aspect of her childhood and her protecting herself from the world with various images and so on, and then the destruction of them somehow represents her growing up or her emerging from this state.
Yes, but they are connected with deadness in a sense, and also with their works of art in a sense also.
Yes, one might say this, yes. One's afraid to put too much theoretical weight in a way on this. I mean,
I'm hoping not to do that, but we're being over-explicit, but I think we have to be. What about the Tintoretto, which clearly, in the course of the unwinding of this very sort of finely worked story, also has a central position which becomes, for want of a better word, emblematic. Could you volunteer something on that again?
Well, again, nothing very clear, I don't think. I mean, it is a work of art, and it gathers round itself the sort of passions which a great work of art, which is also a valuable object, tends to generate. It's loved, and at the same time, it's just an object of value which can be bartered.
And Hugh has to sell it in order to set up his son's attempt at raising his life to a level which we call formal.
Well, yes, Hugh, of course, is in, as it were, setting Randall free, doing something for himself retrospectively. That is, he wishes that he, in the past, perhaps, had acted in what he conceives of as a more free way, and he wants to give Randall, as it were, symbolically for himself, this same opportunity. Yes,
one notices a certain amount of this repetition in the children of various features of the parent's life, which is again part of the multiple plot, I suppose. This novel begins, it's not the only one of your novels that does, with a death, which in a sense is made by the extremely fine, if I may say so, opening scene, a kind of motive for what follows. Is this, again, part of the deliberate patterning of the book, that it should begin with Fanny's death?
Well, it just fell out so, as it were. I mean, one of the subjects of the book is Hugh's new life, as it were, after
Yeah.
his wife's death, and his reliving of things earlier in his life, his rediscovery of things, so that, in a way, Fanny's death is just the convenient starting point for the entire new situation which affects everybody.
Yes. There are many contrasts in the book between wildness and tameness, not only in the rose but in the cat. Here again, you've framed the action with the cat going wild and then being
Yes.
returned at the end. In a sense, this is a deliberate polarity of theme in the novel, isn't it, between art and nature, after a very old-fashioned polarity indeed.
Yes, possibly. I think one can perhaps go too far in finding patterns. I mean, the cat, the cat just arrived. There was the cat. I thought I'll have a cat. And then what does the cat do? This happened really more or less accidentally. And then, in fact, it fitted quite happily into the general pattern.
He goes into the mix, and in a sense, you're no more responsible for what comes out of the mix than anybody else, I suppose.
More or less, yes.
Could I turn to another aspect of this book, which has much in common with other books of yours, and that is the part played in it by love. Every important character in this book is in love with somebody, sometimes rather improbably, and this covers everybody from the age of 14 to the age of 67, I think it is. Now, love is associated in your books with a kind of supernatural, I would say demonic force, which is an actual, which reveals truths about persons. Is that so?
Well, yes, I'm not sure about demonic. In a way, what I would like to do is to portray non-demonic love. I mean, we all know about demonic love. It's the other kind, which is much more difficult to portray. And this, I mean, I don't think this is a particularly successful novel. And, I mean, Anne is not, I think, a particularly successful character, but I was trying in Anne to portray somebody loving in a kind of blank way, where there's no romance, there's no demonism, there's no none of the kind of stormy forces which make love interesting in usually in fiction and in life. And then there's Swan, who makes these sort of rather sloppy remarks, interpreting Anne's love in a way which she herself tends to reject. And this is important, that she rejects it.
Yes, Anne has a good deal to do with rejecting things, instead of simply going along with them the way the others do, all of the others practically. Miranda, however, I think is actually called a changeling at one point, isn't she? This is a figure that you use for, which contains a kind of element of the fey or demonic.
Yes.
But is this the dolls help this, and so does the business with the dagger?
Yes. I mean, they help it atmospherically, yes.
But it's not part of some grand design.
I don't think so, no. I mean, the book portrays different kinds of people loving in different kinds of ways. But the sort of structural contrast is the contrast between Anne and Randall.
Mm-hmm. Can you say anything about the part of Penn, the young Australian grandson?
Well, he's an obvious counterpart to Miranda. In some general way, he represents the good child, as it were. I mean, and it's significant that Emma leaves her money to Penn. I mean, that he is, as it were, the successor, the person to whom one thinks of the book going on, as it were, in the future towards an innocent person and somebody coming from from a more democratic society and so on. I mean, there's a faint criticism of the snobbery, as it were, of the English setup implied in Penn's.
He has a deep love for Miranda, which is rejected with great bitterness and contempt. Is this? How do we see this in the pattern?
Well, this is just another case of being in love. I mean, again, an innocent, a kind of innocent love.
it has, we're not to attach any more, well, we can, of course, if we wish to, but you wouldn't ask us to attach more importance to it than that.
Well, it has that importance.
Yes. And he's made Australian so that the rejection can be flavoured with a certain snobbishness.
Well, this isn't really a very important theme.
It isn't, no.
I mean, I thought I'll make this boy come from somewhere far away,
Yeah.
and then I thought of putting in the Australian background.
He does seem important because he comes up almost at the very outset.
Yes,
the
yes.
first person to describe. Emma herself had no need, presumably, in order to be the ex-mistress of you, to write detective stories, but she does write detective stories. Why?
Well, again, this is purely accidental. I wanted her to be rich, and I thought this was a good way for her to make her money.
Oh, I see. There's no question of death in the rose garden or anything of this kind. Then Nancy Beauchamp is another interesting figure. The confrontation of Randall and Nancy Beauchamp at what is really, in some ways, the heart of the book, I suppose, where he leaves finally. What are we to make of that? This is another case of love throwing you down and standing on you, is it? Or is it something much more trivial than that?
Well, I don't think it has any very weighty significance. I mean, it's just to show that Randall can be loved in a straightforward, moderately selfless way.
Mm-hmm. We're never to think, then, of people being caught unawares and thrown into strange postures by love, as you sometimes do treat it in that way, don't you?
Well, love does always tend to do that, but I don't think I was particularly pursuing that.
No, you do this elsewhere, perhaps more,
Yes.
more than in the Unofficial Rose. And let's just return for a moment to Anne again, because I think she clearly is central to the book. Could you just say again how is the rose which is not a highly developed one, which in fact she seems to be in some sense incapable of this kind of development, but nevertheless is in the truth in a sense in which Randall isn't. Is that right?
Well, this would be intended, yes. In fact, it's very difficult to portray that sort of character without some kind of loss of energy or something, which may make the character uninteresting. But she was certainly intended to be thought of as a good person, and as having this curious sort of unself-awareness, this lack of self, lack of ego, as it were,
Yes.
which is one kind of way of being good.
Mm-hmm. And her spiritual advisor, he is a kind of muffled echo of something important, isn't he?
Yes, and she doesn't recognize anything for herself in this echo.
No, but it is Swan, I think, who says that something like an improper devotion to the idea of form is fatal to love. Do you remember?
Yes. He makes a number of theoretical remarks, some of which I would endorse, but not all.
Not all. Well, and this must be the last point we take up. I don't know if you remember that E.M. Forster once said that the relationship of an author to his characters in a novel is a relationship of love. This is a relationship so important in your novels. Do you feel it's to be analogous to your own relationship to the fiction that you're making?
Well, I think there is an analogy between loving somebody in real life in such a way that you can really will them to be independent of you, leave them free, and loving one's characters. I do love my characters, and the difficulty is the same difficulty, that one must be able to leave them free, to make them independent. This is not easy.